Two teenagers met at a weekend Hebrew school in Virginia in 1982. They bonded over a shared interest in something most adults around them considered a waste of time: computers and the games you could make them run. 2 years later, they pooled together about $100, bought out a friend's share of the company they'd started, and kept making games anyway. 40 years later, that company has made the official mascot of an entire console, one of gaming's most acclaimed action-adventure trilogies, and a story so good it became one of the most watched television shows in HBO's history. It also became known, repeatedly, for one of the harshest working cultures in the entire games industry. This is the story of Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog wasn't always called Naughty Dog. For its first 5 years, it was Jam Software, an acronym for Jason, Andy, and Mike. Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin founded the company in 1984, alongside a third friend, Mike Goyette. When Goyette lost interest and stopped contributing, Rubin and Gavin bought back his share of the company for roughly $100, and redefined the acronym to mean Jason and Andy's Magic. Their first planned project was a skiing game for the Apple II. During development, Gavin accidentally overwrote the only copy of the game's code with a batch of bootleg games he was copying. Rubin rebuilt the entire game from scratch over a single weekend. The finished title, Ski Crazed, was sold to a small publisher called Broadville for $250. The studio spent the rest of the 1980s building a track record on modest, increasingly ambitious projects: Mad Jam, Dream Zone, and Keef the Thief, the latter published by Electronic Arts. On September 9, 1989, Rubin and Gavin formally renamed the company Naughty Dog, severing ties with their earlier publisher. In 1991, Naughty Dog released Rings of Power for the Sega Genesis through Electronic Arts. In 1994, the studio produced Way of the Warrior, a fighting game for the 3DO console. The game itself was a commercial failure, but it caught the attention of one specific person watching from Universal Interactive Studios: producer Mark Cerny, who had previously worked on Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Cerny's interest mattered enormously, because it gave Rubin and Gavin something they hadn't had in a decade of independent development: a 3-title contract and the funding to expand the company beyond its founders. For 10 years, Naughty Dog had survived as exactly 2 people, occasionally 3, making games out of necessity rather than security. Every project before Way of the Warrior had been a bet that the next one might finally break through. Cerny had a specific suggestion for what the next project should be. He told them to make something 3-dimensional, something with a character players could fall in love with. Rubin and Gavin's working title for the project was blunt about its central design problem: Sonic's ass game, because in a 3D platformer with a fixed camera following behind the character, players would spend the entire experience staring at the character's rear. Production began in 1994, drawing direct inspiration from the pre-rendered visual style of Donkey Kong Country, to build the technical foundation for the project. Andy Gavin developed a custom programming language called Game-Oriented Object Lisp, designed specifically to handle the character animation and gameplay systems the game would need. The lead character started as Willy the Wombat, envisioned as a goofy, Zorro-like marsupial. Cartoonist Charles Zambilas and Joe Pearson were brought in to design the character, and the team ultimately settled on an Eastern barred bandicoot for its relative obscurity as an animal, and renamed him Crash. After 14 months of development, Crash Bandicoot was shown to Sony Computer Entertainment, who signed on to publish it. The game launched on August 31st, 1996, and by the end of the year had sold over 1 million units. It went on to sell 6.8 million copies total, and Sony adopted Crash as the PlayStation's unofficial mascot for the next several years. Naughty Dog produced 2 sequels, Cortex Strikes back in 1997 and Warped in 1998, the latter selling over 5.7 million copies and considered by many fans the high point of the original trilogy, followed by the kart racer Crash Team Racing in 1999. Together, the 4 games Naughty Dog made in the series sold over 26 million units. But Universal Interactive, not Naughty Dog, owned the Crash Bandicoot intellectual property, a structural problem that meant the studio building the franchise's success had no long-term ownership stake in it. Creatively exhausted after 4 consecutive Crash titles, and frustrated by the lack of control, Ruben and Gavin decided not to make a 5th. Instead, with the PlayStation 2 on the horizon, the studio wanted to build something for Sony directly, without Universal as an intermediary. In 2001, Sony bought Naughty Dog outright, making it a first-party studio, while Universal retained the rights to Crash Bandicoot, which would go on to be developed by other studios entirely. Freed to create something new, Naughty Dog built Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, released in 2001 as a colorful platformer in the same spirit as Crash. The sequel, Jak 2, released in 2003, abandoned that tone almost entirely, introducing guns, a darker story, an open-world city structure, and a noticeable, more mature register than its predecessor. The shift split the existing fanbase at the time, with some players embracing the new direction and others feeling the series had abandoned what made the original distinctive. Jak 3 in 2004 and the racing spin-off Jak X Combat Racing in 2005 continued in that grittier register. Across the various entries Naughty Dog itself developed, the series sold approximately 9 million units. By 2005, Ruben and Gavin had spent 18 years and 14 games building Naughty Dog from a garage operation into a first-party Sony studio responsible for 2 genuinely beloved franchises. Together, those 14 titles had sold over 35 million copies and generated more than $1 billion in revenue. Then, within the same general period, the studio was finishing the Jak and Daxter series. Its 2 founders began stepping back. By 2004, both men had left the company they'd built since they were teenagers, handing control to Evan Wells and a young writer-director named Amy Hennig, who was about to take the studio somewhere it had never been. Naughty Dog's first PlayStation 3 project required the studio to abandon almost everything that had made its previous games successful. Development on Uncharted: Drake's Fortune began in 2005, with the project formally announced at E3 2006, created by writer and director Amy Hennig, who had joined Naughty Dog in 2003 and previously contributed to the Jak and Daxter series. The game was a deliberate departure from the fantastical cartoon-style worlds of Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, instead building a grounded cinematic action-adventure following treasure hunter Nathan Drake. Uncharted: Drake's Fortune launched on November 19, 2007, to strong reviews praising its technical polish and cinematic presentation, drawing comparisons to summer blockbuster films rather than typical console action games. Uncharted 2: Among Thieves followed in 2009 and became the highest-selling game in its release month. Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception arrived in 2011, with Hennig directing and writing all 3, firmly establishing herself as the singular creative voice behind the franchise. While the main Naughty Dog team worked on Uncharted 3, the studio attempted something it had tried and failed at once before, splitting into 2 full development teams working simultaneously. A secondary team began work in 2009 on a project codenamed Project Ting, later revealed as The Last of Us, led by game director Bruce Straley and creative director Neil Druckmann. The Last of Us launched for PlayStation 3 on June 14, 2013, selling 1.3 million units in its first week and 3.4 million within 3 weeks. The game's commercial and critical success gave Druckmann and Straley enormous internal standing within the studio, standing that would directly shape what happened next. In March 2014, roughly 7 to 8 months into production on Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, Amy Hennig left Naughty Dog. The studio had publicly stated that Druckmann and Straley were not involved in what transpired, and Hennig herself has never confirmed the exact reason for her departure, describing it only as creative differences. But voice actor Nolan North later said the team had been deep into production under Hennig's direction, including a different supporting cast, before her exit, after which they got rid of everything we did and rebuilt the project from the ground up under Druckmann and Straley. Whatever the precise internal mechanics, the practical result was unambiguous. The era of Naughty Dog, defined by a single outside creative voice, adventurous, lighter in tone, built around Hennig's hero journey sensibility, was over. The studio that finished Uncharted 4 under Druckmann and Straley's direction in 2016 was, in both leadership and creative philosophy, a fundamentally different organization than the one that had started it. The new era came with a cost that extended well beyond the writer's room, and it was a cost current and former employees would spend the next decade describing publicly. Naughty Dog's reputation for technical and narrative excellence has run alongside a second, far less flattering reputation, one of the most demanding crunch cultures in an industry already known for them. Hennig herself later described working an average of 80 hours a week during her time at the studio, telling an interviewer in 2016 that the toll was not worth it, citing colleagues who missed family milestones and suffered lasting physical and psychological effects from sustained overtime. The pattern continued after her departure. Reporting on the development of The Last of Us Part 2 described a studio culture built on genuine perfectionism, the kind of obsessive detail work that made a sack of grain visibly deflate as it emptied in Uncharted 4, or made Ellie blink and turn away from a flashlight in The Last of Us, but achieved, employees said, no matter the human cost. Naughty Dog lost a significant number of design and art department staff following the brutal production cycle of Uncharted 4 and its expansion The Lost Legacy, with several former employees attributing the departures directly to burnout rather than any single creative disagreement. The studio's compensation structure compounded the problem for its most vulnerable workers. Salaried staff were not paid additional wages for overtime, though they typically received bonuses after a game shipped. Contractors and hourly workers, more common at Naughty Dog following the post-Uncharted 4 staffing losses, were paid time and a half and double time under standard California labor law, but many worked on limited contracts with no bonus eligibility, creating, as one author described it, this unspoken agreement where extra unpaid hours functioned as an audition for permanent employment. Naughty Dog's defenders and critics inside the industry tend to describe the same underlying fact in opposite terms. Some employees generally valued the culture, well compensated, given extended time off between projects, proud to have shipped games widely, regarded as the best in the medium. Others described it as simply unsustainable, a studio that produced extraordinary results by treating its staff physical and personal limits as a cost of doing business, rather than a constraint to design around. None of it slowed the studio's output or its ambition. The project the crunch had paid for was about to become one of the most successful pieces of interactive storytelling ever made. The Last of Us Part 2 released June 19, 2020, sold 10 million copies within its first 2 years, and won more than 320 individual Game of the Year related awards, an extraordinary total for a single release. In 2022, Naughty Dog released The Last of Us Part 1, a full remake of the original 2013 game, rebuilt for PlayStation 5 with modern technology and design refinements. By January 2023, the complete franchise has sold over 37 million copies and crossed $1 billion in lifetime revenue, according to a former PlayStation senior executive. Then, on January 15, 2023, HBO premiered a live-action television adaptation of The Last of Us, co-written by Neil Druckmann himself, alongside series creator Craig Mazin. The premiere was watched by almost 40 million viewers across linear televisions and HBO Max within its first 2 months, making it HBO's most watched series debut. The show was renewed for a second season before it first had even finished airing, and the television series brought a direct, measurable commercial benefit to the games. Sony reported the show drove more than 4 million new players to the franchise and increased overall engagement by roughly 150%. The television adaptation succeeded specifically because it didn't treat the source material as disposable. Druckmann's direct involvement in the writer's room, work he continued through the show's first 2 seasons before stepping back from creative duties on the series in mid-2025, meant the adaptation carried the same narrative instincts that had made the games critically significant in the first place, rather than simply licensing the IP out to a studio with no connection to the original creative team. A third season of the television series began filming in March 2026. As of this video, Druckmann has acknowledged more story to tell in the games themselves, while also cautioning, as recently as March 2025, against assuming a third mainline game is guaranteed, suggesting the television series itself might ultimately carry the story forward instead. 40 years after 2 teenagers met at the weekend Hebrew school and decided computers were more interesting than whatever else they were supposed to be doing, the studio they built has now told the same story across 3 separate mediums: a 2013 game, a 2020 sequel, and a television series watched by tens of millions of people who may never pick up a controller at all. Naughty Dog has reinvented its core identity twice, first from cartoon mascot platformers into cinematic action-adventure, then from action-adventure into the kind of prestige awards-driven storytelling that crosses entirely out of the games industry. Both times the studio bet everything on a project nobody had asked them to make. Both times it worked. And both times the people actually making it paid a price the credits never fully show. 2 teenagers met at the Hebrew school in Virginia and bonded over computers nobody else in their lives took seriously. Naughty Dog's first decade was built on a deleted ski game, a $250 sale, and a redefined acronym after a founding partner walked away. Its second decade gave the PlayStation its mascot, sold over 26 million Crash Bandicoot copies, and then walked away from that exact success to build something new with Jak and Daxter, a series that split its own fanbase the moment it decided to grow up. Its third decade abandoned cartoon platforming entirely for Uncharted's cinematic adventure under Amy Hennig, and then, almost as an experiment run by a second team nobody initially expected to succeed, built The Last of Us, and with it an entirely new creative leadership. And in its fourth decade, that experiment became a billion-dollar franchise and one of the most successful television adaptations a video game has ever received. Built by the studio's own employees' accounts, on a culture of perfectionism that has cost many of them more than any studio should ask. Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin left the studio they founded over 20 years ago. What they built was never stopped reinventing itself since. It has also never fully answered the question of what that reinvention has cost the people doing the work. That's the story of Naughty Dog.